My husband's family is furious with me for catching him cheating. They're blaming me for pushing him away, and now I'm ready to cut them all off for good. I always thought that if I caught my husband cheating, the hardest part would be dealing with the betrayal. But I never expected what happened next. Mark and I have been married for 7 years. I'm 34 and he's 36. We've been through ups and downs, sure, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. At least that's what I thought until 3 weeks ago, when I discovered he'd been sleeping with a woman from his office named Jessica. As if that betrayal wasn't enough, his family, who I'd always been close to, had the audacity to turn on me. They said I pushed him away. It started slowly, with subtle changes in Mark's behavior. He'd stay late at work more often, dodge my questions, and keep his phone glued to his hand. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd laugh it off, tell me I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was off. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and did the one thing I promised myself I'd never do. I went through his phone while he was in the shower. I felt horrible for doing it, but I had to know. And that's when I saw it. Text messages between him and Jessica. The texts were graphic. They weren't just friendly exchanges. They were making plans to meet up, talking about sneaking around, and there were even a few messages saying how much they missed each other when they couldn't be together. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through. My stomach twisted in knots. I couldn't believe this was happening. Mark had been seeing someone else behind my back for months. And the worst part? I felt like I already knew. It was like my gut had been screaming at me for weeks, but I had ignored it. When Mark came out of the bathroom, I was ready. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice shaking as I held up his phone. Mark looked at me, saw the phone in my hand, and his face went pale. "It's not what you think," he stammered, but I wasn't in the mood for his excuses. "You've been sleeping with her, haven't you?" I demanded. He didn't even try to deny it. "It just happened," he muttered, like that would make things better. "It just happened?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You don't accidentally sleep with someone for months, Mark. You made a choice." I felt like I was going to explode. "Pack your things and get out," I said, my voice cold and final. "I don't want to hear another word from you." He stood there for a moment like he was going to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded and started gathering his clothes. I watched him, numb, as he packed a bag. I should have felt something. Anger, sadness, relief, but instead I felt nothing. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. The man I had trusted with everything had betrayed me, and now I was standing there, watching him leave. But little did I know, the real nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, I got a call from his mother, Linda. I had always been close with Linda. She was like a second mother to me, and I thought she was calling to check in on me, maybe offer some support. But the second I answered, I realized how wrong I was. "I heard what happened," Linda said, her voice cold and accusatory. "You need to understand, Mark wouldn't have done this if you hadn't pushed him away." I was speechless. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You're blaming me for this." But Linda didn't stop. "He's been unhappy for a long time," she said. "You've been so focused on your job and your friends that you've neglected him. A man has needs, and if those needs aren't being met at home, he's going to look elsewhere. What did you expect?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mark was the one who had cheated, and somehow I was being blamed for it. "This isn't my fault," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mark is the one who betrayed me." But Linda wasn't listening. "You should have done more to keep him happy," she continued, as if I was the one who had driven him to cheat. I hung up on her, too angry to continue the conversation. I thought that was the worst of it, but then Mark's sister, Katie, called. Katie and I had always been close. She was a bridesmaid at our wedding, and I had always considered her a friend. But when I picked up the phone, her voice was just as cold as her mother's. "You should have seen this coming," Katie said flatly. "Mark's been miserable for years, and you didn't even notice. If you had been paying more attention to him, maybe this wouldn't have happened." My jaw dropped. "He cheated on me, Katie," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "How is this my fault?" But Katie, like her mother, didn't back down. "You pushed him away," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You've been so wrapped up in your own life, your career, your friends, everything but your marriage, that you forgot about him. What did you expect?" I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. This was insane. My husband had betrayed me, and now his family was acting like I was the one who had done something wrong. It felt like I was living in some kind of alternate reality where nothing made sense, and I knew it wasn't over. The phone calls didn't stop. Over the next few days, I heard from more of Mark's family, his cousins, his aunts, even his dad. They all had the same message. that Mark had cheated, but it was somehow my fault. They acted like I had driven him into the arms of another woman, like I hadn't been a good enough wife. Every call left me feeling more and more isolated, like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality. I had been part of this family for years, and now they were treating me like I was disposable. I couldn't believe how quickly they had turned on me. Finally, I had enough. I blocked Linda, Katie, and the rest of Mark's family from my phone. I couldn't take their toxic accusations anymore. I needed space to figure out what I was going to do next, and their constant attacks weren't helping. Mark had been texting me nonstop, begging me to talk, but I wasn't ready to hear his excuses. After a week of silence, I knew I couldn't avoid him forever. I texted him back and told him to come by the house to get the rest of his things. We needed to talk, and I needed some kind of closure. Mark showed up later that evening, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red, and it was clear he hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," he said as soon as he walked through the door. "I never wanted this to happen." I crossed my arms, glaring at him. "You didn't want this to happen?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've been sleeping with another woman for months, Mark. You lied to me. How did you think this was going to end?" He didn't say anything, just stood there looking at the floor like a scolded child. "It just happened," he muttered again, and that's when I lost it. "Stop saying that." I shouted, "Stop acting like this was some accident. You didn't trip and fall into bed with her, Mark. You made a choice. You chose to cheat, and now you're trying to act like it wasn't your fault. Like you had no control over it?" He looked down at the floor, guilt written all over his face. "I'm sorry," he said again, but the words felt hollow. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "Sorry isn't enough, Mark. You destroyed everything." He tried to plead with me, but I was done. "Pack your things and leave," I said coldly. "We're done." He nodded, not saying a word, and started packing up his stuff. I watched him, feeling a strange sense of relief as he filled his duffel bag. This was it. It was really over. My marriage, the life I had built with him. It was all ending right in front of me. But instead of feeling devastated, I felt free. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. I had spent so long trying to hold everything together, but now it was time to let go. Just as Mark was about to leave, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Your family has been calling me nonstop," I snapped, my voice rising. "They've been blaming me for this. Do you have any idea how that feels? To be betrayed by your husband and then attacked by his family like it's my fault." Mark looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I'm so sorry. I'll talk to them." But I wasn't done. "It's too late for that, Mark. You let this happen. You let them treat me like garbage, and now you expect me to just forgive you." He stood there for a moment like he didn't know what to say. "I'll fix it," he muttered, but the words felt empty. "It's too late for that," I said, my voice cold. "You need to leave, and you need to tell your family to leave me alone." He nodded, defeated, and walked out the door. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the closed door. Part of me wanted to feel sad, but I didn't. I felt relief. Mark was out of my life, and now it was time to start picking up the pieces. But the calls didn't stop. The next morning, I woke up to another barrage of texts from his family. They were furious that I had kicked him out. "You're throwing away your marriage over one mistake." Katie texted me, "You need to forgive him. Marriage is about working through the tough times." I blocked her number without even responding, but the calls kept coming. His mom, his cousins, even his dad, they all had something to say about how I was giving up on my marriage. "He's your husband. You're supposed to stand by him through thick and thin," his mom lectured me in a voicemail. I couldn't believe the audacity. One mistake? He had been lying to me for months, sneaking around with another woman, and they wanted me to forgive and forget like it was nothing. It was like they were living in a completely different world. The final straw came when Mark's dad showed up at my house, unannounced. I opened the door, and there he was, standing on my front porch with a stern look on his face. "We need to talk," he said, pushing his way inside before I could even respond. "You need to stop acting like a child and forgive my son." I stood there, staring at him in disbelief. "You're blaming me for this too?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Mark is the one who cheated, not me. How am I supposed to just forgive him?" But Mark's dad didn't back down. "People make mistakes," he said dismissively. "No one's perfect. If you had been a better wife, this never would have happened." That was it. I had been blamed, attacked, and guilt-tripped for weeks, but hearing those words from his dad pushed me over the edge. "Get out," I said, my voice low and firm. "You have no right to come into my house and blame me for this." His dad looked at me like I was crazy. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice rising. "You're going to regret this. Mark is your husband. You made vows." But I didn't back down. The only mistake I made was staying with him for as long as I did. I said, my voice shaking with emotion, "Now get out." He stared at me for a moment, then turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. I had finally stood up to them, and I knew I had made the right choice. After that confrontation, I knew I was done with Mark's family for good. They had always been controlling, always trying to manipulate me, and I had let them get away with it for years. But not anymore. I was done letting them make me feel small, done letting them blame me for things that weren't my fault. I spent the next few days cleaning out the house, getting rid of anything that reminded me of Mark. It was cathartic in a way, like I was purging the past and making room for something new. I was ready to move on, ready to start rebuilding my life. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in months, and focused on taking care of myself. Some days were harder than others. There were times when I missed Mark, or at least the version of him I thought I knew. But those moments passed quickly. I knew I had made the right decision by cutting him and his family out of my life. They had treated me like I was disposable, but I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Mark tried to reach out a few more times, but I ignored him. I wasn't ready to hear his excuses. I had spent too long living in his shadow, trying to make everyone else happy. Now it was time to focus on myself. I started going to therapy, which helped me process everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had so much anger, hurt, and betrayal to work through. But therapy helped me see things clearly. I realized that I had spent too long trying to please people who didn't deserve it. I deserved better than Mark and his toxic family. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend at a coffee shop, someone I hadn't seen in years. We started chatting, and before I knew it, we had plans to meet up for dinner later that week. It felt good to reconnect with people, to start rebuilding my social life. For so long, I had been wrapped up in my marriage, trying to keep everything together, that I had lost sight of the things that made me happy. Reconnecting with friends made me realize that I wasn't alone. I had people in my life who cared about me, who had my back, and who wanted to see me happy. As time passed, I started to feel more like myself again. I wasn't constantly worried about what Mark was doing or what his family thought of me. I was living my life on my own terms, and it felt good. I started traveling more, something I had always wanted to do but had put off because of Mark. I visited new places, met new people, and had new experiences. Every trip felt like a step forward, like I was reclaiming parts of myself that I had lost along the way. I was finally free to live my life the way I wanted to, and it was empowering. But as I moved forward, there were still moments when the anger and hurt would resurface. One day, while scrolling through social media, I came across a photo of Mark and Jessica together at a work event. It hit me like a punch to the gut. There they were, smiling like they hadn't destroyed my life. But instead of spiraling, I closed the app and took a deep breath. They weren't my problem anymore. They were just ghosts of a life I had left behind. I wasn't going to let their actions dictate my happiness any longer. It was time to fully let go. The more distance I put between myself and Mark, the clearer everything became. I started to see that the way his family had treated me wasn't new. It had been happening for years, but I had been too caught up in trying to please everyone to notice. They had always expected me to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, and when I didn't meet their impossible standards, they blamed me for everything. The affair was just the final straw, but now that I was out of their toxic orbit, I could finally see things clearly. I wasn't the problem. They were. As the weeks turned into months, I began to heal. I threw myself into new hobbies, explored new interests, and started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I had spent so long trying to be everything for everyone that I had lost sight of who I really was. But now I was learning to trust myself again, to listen to my own needs and desires. It wasn't easy, but every day I felt a little bit stronger, a little more sure of who I was and what I wanted out of life. I was finally reclaiming my sense of self. Eventually, I heard through the grapevine that Mark and Jessica had officially gotten together. They were living together now, apparently, and people in their office were talking about how quickly it all had happened. I thought hearing that would hurt, but it didn't. It just confirmed what I had already known, that Mark wasn't the man I thought he was, and that our marriage had been over long before I found out about the affair. I felt a strange sense of closure. He had moved on, and so had I. We were living two separate lives now, and I was grateful for it. Looking back, I realized that Mark's affair, as painful as it was, had been the wake-up call I needed. I had been stuck in a marriage that wasn't working for a long time, but I hadn't wanted to admit it. The affair forced me to take a hard look at my life and make the changes I had been avoiding. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about everything that had led up to it. Mark and I had grown apart, and neither of us had wanted to face the truth. But now I was free to live my life on my own terms. I also realized that I had spent far too long trying to please other people, especially Mark's family. They had always made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I had to prove myself to them. But now I could see that their expectations were impossible. No matter what I did, they would have found something to criticize. Cutting them out of my life was the best decision I could have made. I was no longer trying to win their approval, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I was finally free from their toxic influence. As time went on, I started dating again. At first, it was scary. I hadn't been single in years, and the thought of putting myself out there felt daunting. But slowly, I started to enjoy it. I met new people, had fun, and started to rediscover what I wanted in a partner. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but it felt good to be in control of my love life again. I was no longer settling for less than I deserved. I was learning to trust myself again, to listen to my instincts, and to prioritize my own happiness above all else. One day, out of the blue, I got a text from Mark. "I miss you," it said. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I hadn't heard from him in months, and now here he was, trying to come back into my life, but instead of responding, I deleted the message. I didn't miss him. I didn't miss the lies, the betrayal, the constant feeling of not being good enough. I was done with Mark, and I was done with his toxic family. I had built a new life for myself, and there was no room for him in it. The future felt wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about it. I wasn't tied down by anyone's expectations or demands. I was living my life for myself, and it felt amazing. I had learned so much from everything that had happened, about myself, about relationships, and about what I truly wanted in life. I wasn't the same person I was when Mark and I had first gotten married. I was stronger now, more confident, more sure of who I was and what I wanted. And that was something no one could take away from me. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can't rely on other people to define your worth. For so long, I had let Mark and his family dictate how I saw myself. I had let their opinions shape the way I viewed my role as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, as a person. But now I was done with that. I was learning to trust myself again, to believe in my own strength and resilience. I didn't need their validation anymore. I was enough just as I was. And that realization had changed everything. Life is funny sometimes. What felt like the worst thing that could ever happen turned out to be the best thing for me. Mark's betrayal hurt, but it also set me free. It gave me the push I needed to take control of my life, to stop living for other people and start living for myself. And now, as I look toward the future, I feel hopeful. I know there will be challenges ahead, but I also know that I'm strong enough to face them. Because if I've learned anything, it's that I'm capable of surviving whatever life throws at me. Mark's family never reached out again after I blocked them, and I'm grateful for that. Maybe they're still blaming me for everything. Maybe they've moved on. I don't care. They're in my past now, and that's where they'll stay. I've let go of the need to prove myself to them, to make them see me in a certain way. I'm done with their expectations, done with their judgment. I'm free, and that's all that matters. Moving forward, I know that I'll never let anyone make me feel small again. I'll never settle for less than I deserve. As I move forward with my life, I'm focused on the things that truly matter. My career, my friendships, my happiness, those are the things that define me now, not my relationship with Mark or his family or the person I used to be. I'm building a life that's mine, a life that reflects who I truly am. And it feels good. For the first time in years, I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about the possibilities that lie ahead, about the new experiences I'll have, and about the person I'm becoming. The pain of what happened will always be there in some small way, but it no longer controls me. I've taken my power back. I've reclaimed my life, and I'm moving forward with my head held high. I'm proud of how far I've come, proud of the strength I've found within myself. I'm not the same person I was when all of this started, and I'm grateful for that. I've grown, I've learned, and I'm ready for whatever comes next, because now I know that I can handle it. I can handle anything. So here I am, standing at the edge of a new chapter in my life, ready to take the next step. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I'm stronger than I ever thought I could be. I've survived the worst, and I've come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever. And as I move forward, I'm taking that strength with me. I'm ready for whatever comes next, and for the first time in a long time, I feel free. Free to be myself. Free to live my life on my own terms.